Welcome to Tabletop Gaming with Juice. I'm Juice, and this is the Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide Chapter 5 review. This is a great chapter. This chapter is exactly what I was hoping to find when I picked up this Dungeon Master's Guide. After the first few chapters, I was a little skeptical. But this chapter is packed full of good information, from mechanical things to inspiration to tables, very useful tables. This is the best chapter I've read so far. So I will break it down by section and I will tell you my thoughts on it. It starts off, it's called Adventure Environments. And it starts off talking about dungeons. It gives you a couple quick tables so you can do a dungeon location, and then it has another table for exotic locations such as planar worlds. Sorry, my daughter's doing something. And things like that. It also talks about being creative and telling you some things to think about when creating your dungeons. Very good. One of my favorite things about this is in the paragraphs before you get to the dungeon creator table, it's talking about things to keep in mind for different monsters. So say you have a dungeon and a beholder is there, you might have openings you might not have stairs or ramps or anything like that. You might just have an opening to the next floor, because they can basically float up there and be on the next floor. It also mentions, like, if you have the Yontai, which are the snake-like creatures, you might have ramps instead of stairs, and things like that. So I thought that was really good how they described that, and things to think about based on your monsters. For the new DM just starting out, you might not think about that. You might just think, oh, I want this room here and this room there. For the more experienced DM, you've probably thought of this or seen this before, but again, very, very useful. It goes into a few more tables. So the Dungeon Creator table, which gives you monsters that potentially created it, or creatures in general, such as elves and dwarves, humans, or, like I said before, a beholder. It then goes into cults and religious groups and gives you a few to roll for. Their alignments, the NPC class. Then it goes into the dungeon's purpose. And I thought this was pretty interesting too. So a lot of people I know, when they do dungeons, they don't really think about what the purpose is. They just say, oh, there's a dungeon here and it's their base. Simple as that. I'm guilty of doing it before myself. But this is kind of cool because it breaks down the different things. So for instance, a death trap. It might be a lich's phylactery and he's trying to milk souls for his phylactery. Another thing it mentioned was a maze. Maybe this is a maze that they used to send prisoners there to feed them to whatever creature was in there, such as a minotaur. But it gives you a few different things and ways to think about it. Again, like this section. It then goes into the history and gives you a table for dungeon history, which again can add something to it, which is, again, I think it's a very good section. It goes into dungeon inhabitants and dungeon factions. And it mentions something in here I haven't really thought much about before either. It talks about how maybe you can infiltrate the dungeon secretly and turn factions against each other. So maybe a bunch of goblins and orcs are serving for, it uses this as the example, mind flayers. Well, maybe you sneak in and try to get them to turn against the mind flayers or the illithids. I thought that was pretty interesting. It's not something I've ever thought about in game, but I could definitely see why you would want to do it. It then goes into dungeon ecology and encounter difficulty, and then talks about mapping a dungeon. It gives a lot of good tips here. Not going to go into it all, but again, a very, very good section. Then it goes into dungeon features, and it talks about the walls and thinking about what the walls look like, feel like, things like that. It does mention in here about the smells and odor somewhere. Oh, I'm not even there yet. But anyways, so it talks about the walls and thinking about that. It then talks about the doors, right? And so you might have stuck doors, which might just be a simple DC strength check. It talks about locked doors, which might be picking locks, and barred doors from the other side, which are a little more difficult. It also talks about secret doors and how you're going to use passive wisdom most of the time, but if they're actively searching, you'll then use their perception roll. Opening a secret door might require an investigation check to figure out how you would open it, and then something to open it. Talks about concealed doors, portcullises, darkness and light, which is a good section, honey. A good section where it talks about dim light, torches, things like that. Then it talks about air quality, and it talks a little bit about smells, which I thought was pretty interesting. It is an often neglected thing with a lot of games I've seen. It talks about sounds, on how in a dungeon your sounds are going to travel further. It's going to be easier to hear what's going on. And basically the alarms are going to be sounded almost immediately when you open a door in a dungeon. It goes into dungeon hazards. Now, this section, again, is fantastic. It talks about detecting a hazard and hazard severity. And then it goes into a couple different molds, spider webs. I like the molds and the spider webs because it gives you some DC things to think about. Then it goes into wilderness, okay? Now, the wilderness section, again, a very good section, much like the dungeon section. It talks about your travel montage, hour-by-hour approach, however you do it, whether you do it as a travel montage or an hour-by-hour approach. It seems like the travel montage is more cinematic. The hour-by-hour approach is more like keeping your players on toes. Mapping a wilderness. Talks about movement on the map. Wilderness features. So then again, you're thinking about the different features that you might come by traveling. It talks about monster lairs, monuments, and it gives you a table for monuments, which is pretty interesting. I like that. It talks about ruins a little bit, settlements, strongholds. Then it goes into weird locales, and it gives you a table. For example, you could have a wishing well, a boulder carved with talking faces, which I think is awesome. A few other things. So floating earth moat with a tower on it, haunted hill. Anyways, good stuff. Then it goes into wilderness survival, where it talks about the weather. And it gives you a table that you can roll for the temperature, the wind, the precipitation. So I think that is a cool section if you want to go with random weather. Maybe you have a wizard who can control the weather and you just feel like using this as the tables for how he controls it. It talks about extreme cold, gives you some DC checks for these things too, which is kind of nice. So it's more of a survival in the wilderness thing. Extreme heat, strong wind, and heavy precipitation. Talks a little bit about high altitude, which I don't think I've seen in a book before. As a sports fan, you hear about the high altitude in Denver affecting athletes all the time. Obviously, most of the people watching this video are probably not big sports fans. But yeah, I've heard mention of high altitude in sports a lot. Never really heard it mentioned in RPG games unless you're climbing a mountain. But even then. It talks about wilderness hazards, and it goes into desecrated ground, frigid water, quicksand, razor vine, slippery ice, and thin ice. And again, all these things have DC checks. So basically, you can plan a game, go to the book, and take these things and just boom, there you go. You've got the mechanics for something you've already planned. I like this. So then it goes into foraging, and it talks about food and water, things like that. And you have DC checks based on how easy and hard it is, right? So I think that is an awesome thing. Uh, Talks a little more about food and water, and it talks about getting lost. Personally, I don't spend a lot of time with players getting lost, but it's something I might consider doing here in the future now that I've got these nice, wonderful tables that make it simple. And, you know, I've got the tips for how to do it in a convenient, for me, and way that's not going to seem, I don't know, like you're dragging the game out. So I think that's good. So it gives you wilderness navigation and it gives you DC checks. Excuse me. Then it talks about settlements, gives you all sorts of things like race relations, rulers, status, notable traits, what it's known for, the current calamity. So that's 5 tables right there. Then it goes into random buildings, and you can roll for the building type, which then takes you to subtables. So then you can roll for the residence, religious building, tavern name generator, which they're okay. Usually in a book, you don't find a lot of good name generators. Online is where you'll find the best name generators, but it's got some decent things, some interesting combos. Then it goes into a warehouse and a shop. So lots of different buildings that you can come up with from these tables. Then it talks about mapping a settlement. Then it goes into the last portion of the chapter where it's talking about urban encounters. So now it's all city stuff. So law and order, trial, sentences, random urban encounters. So it gives you a table for the random urban encounters. And then it breaks those down and gives you a paragraph about how you can use those. Again, excellent. I mean, this is exactly what a new DM needs. This is exactly what an old DM needs. It's perfect. So you go into unusual environments, such as underwater visibility, the sea, talks a little bit about swimming, random encounters at sea, weather at sea, the sky. This is where it gives you sky, an airship. It gives you different types of boats that you can buy. Talks about owning a ship, your crew, your passengers, cargo, damage threshold, ship repair. And then it goes into traps, right? So the traps, again, good stuff here. The traps are a little bit, compared to the things like the slimes and stuff from previous pages in this chapter, it doesn't give you a lot of traps. It gives you a quick breakdown on how you can make a trap, going from the trigger to disarming it, things like that. And then it gives you some DCs and attack bonuses, and then the damage severity by level. So it's okay. It still is enough to give you what you need. So then it gives you sample traps. So 1, 2, it gives you collapsing roof, falling net, fire-breathing statue, pits, poison darts, poison needle, rolling sphere, sphere of annihilation. And that's the chapter. So this is my favorite chapter. I have no gripes about it. There are only 6 traps. There could have been more traps. That's the only thing I would really say. But it has a lot of stuff. I mean, technically, in other books, I've seen them use like the slimes as traps and things like that. So really, this chapter has a lot of stuff, a lot of good mechanical things that you can add to your arsenal as a DM for your 5th edition games, and a lot of good tips, a lot of good tables. I mean, this chapter is my favorite chapter so far. So I almost say that this chapter alone might be worth buying this book. That's how good I think this chapter is. Be sure to let me know what you think of this chapter. If you haven't read the book yet and don't have the book, feel free to comment still. I'd love to hear your thoughts. The next chapter will be chapter 6, and it's titled Between Adventures. I'm really looking forward to reading this one. I've skimmed it a few times. I think it's going to be a good one. And yeah, again, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, share my videos. Go to www.rpgjuice.com. I have a new blog up about gamers and when things change to be more about how the rules are written as opposed to the DM having power, basically. Also, if you feel like liking me on Facebook, go to Tabletop Gaming with Juice. I also have a GM Juice when I'm trying to phase that one out and make it all the Tabletop Gaming with Juice page. And then Tabletop Gaming with Juice on Twitter. If you're seeing this somewhere else, be sure to go to YouTube and subscribe to Tabletop Gaming with Juice. I'd greatly appreciate it. And yeah, go to the Tabletop RPG one-shot group if you're interested in playing online games with the best players in the world. I truly mean that. I will be running a 5th edition game next Thursday. It is full. I brought in 4 new players from the one-shot group who haven't played games yet in the one-shot group, and I'm bringing 1 player who hasn't played a game yet but is scheduled to play in an upcoming campaign of mine. And also I'm bringing in Andrew Knapp, who has played in quite a few games of mine, but I'm bringing him in to possibly help the newer people out and, to ensure that there's some good RP, because he's a player I definitely trust and I'm comfortable with. So hopefully this provides the best experience possible for our new players, and they get comfortable and start running games themselves with the one-shot group. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.